welcome everybody to the Solidarity in Coffee webinar. I wanted to start tonight off with the land acknowledgement and to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And if you are in a different territory, I encourage you to think of that as well. So Solidarity in Coffee. The name came to me pretty fast when I was trying to think of a title for this webinar. I worked in cafes for several years, and I would always talk to customers about how wonderful the first cup of coffee of the day can be, or a cup of tea, and how delicious a certain drink was, or a roast of coffee. But it's rare that people continue the conversation on what it took to get that drink in their cup. It's a great opportunity to explain to someone the impact that they can have by purchasing from a coffee or a company that takes into consideration the entire process, or seed to cup. And that can lead into sharing stories about Indigenous farmers and the centuries of experience that they have with them. And they are able to produce these wonderful quality coffees, among other things. It's also a great time to educate people on fair trade and other certifications, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. I thought I would introduce myself. My name is Keely Carter. I go by she, her. I joined you through Breaking the Silence, but became involved with this organization through Just Us Coffee, who I've had the wonderful experience of working for the past 15 years. My relationship with Breaking the Silence really strengthened about 2.5 years ago when I started planning and preparing to go on a delegation to Guatemala. And initially, I just wanted to go on this delegation so that I could come back and explain what the organization did a little bit more or better to customers. But obviously, what I got out of that trip and experience was so much more. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to do today. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about the history of Breaking the Silence and Just Us Coffee, and hear how this long-term relationship started. We'll then move on to the Highlands Committee of Small-Scale Farmers, which I will refer to as CCDA, partner organization of Breaking the Silence, where Just Us purchases some of their green beans from. We'll also talk about the differences in certifications when it comes to fair trade, SPP, and direct trade. And we will then have Joey Pituello join us from Just Us Coffee, who's going to go a bit more in depth with coffee pricing and talking about that. And then we will finish off with a call to action. And we'll also have a question period and just things that you can do to help continue to support the people of Guatemala. Let's start off with welcoming Lisa Roberts, who is here with us. Lisa is here. Some would say she's the original connection between Breaking the Silence, CCDA, and before even Just Us Coffee was Just Us Coffee. And yeah, Lisa, I would love to hand it off to you if you want to tell that wonderful story.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And I honestly feel like even it's so long ago, and I haven't been asked to think about it for years. And so I'm still hoping that I might, come across some more detailed notes of the actual genesis of things. But yeah, I was until quite recently an MLA here in Nova Scotia, but in 1997 I was a graduate and a recent graduate in international development studies from Dal. I went to Guatemala. I actually joined a group of folks, mostly from PEI, who went on a school bus I joined them in New Brunswick, and we took 2 weeks to get to Guatemala in 1996. And then I went back in 1997, and I ended up as a coordinator funded through CUSO, a cooperant, with Project Accompaniment, which was a project of solidarity between folks across Canada and people in Guatemala who were returning to Guatemala as returning refugees. And at that point, or at the point that that solidarity effort began, it was before the peace accords had been signed. So the country was still in a period of civil war. Um, I was a cooperant. I was in Guatemala City when the peace accords were signed, or when the official peace was declared, and so I was relatively late in the project, and um, and it was a real period of trying to figure out what our focus should be, what our work should be to be in solidarity, um, and I had the opportunity to, because there weren't a lot of accompaniers coming, because there weren't a lot of new returnees coming back into the country who needed accompaniment. In 1999, towards the end of my time in Guatemala, I had the opportunity to plan for and assist a Breaking the Silence delegation. Um, and I had gotten to know Catherine Anderson, who is on the call tonight. Because she would often stay with me in Guatemala City during her time there, and she was, building relationships over many years with different organizations in Guatemala. But in 1999, there was sort of this moment of opportunity where there was like, well, who else do we want to meet, or what other, if we look around, what else is going on? And so I heard, I had some different meetings with different solidarity groups doing different kinds of work, and was suggested that I might connect with the Comité Campesino del Altiplano, the CCDA, because at that time they had just very recently, been successful in acquiring land, land where their people may have been present earlier, but somehow I don't know the whole process, or I don't recall the whole process, but they had been able to acquire land, and this land had coffee on it. And so they were actively looking for relationships that would help them to turn, help them to sustain their efforts. This was not by any intention, a victory in the end of their journey. It was just the very beginning of their journey. And to be frank, I'm not sure at what point in my planning I knew that Jeff Moore was coming on the delegation, but I think I did know at some point. And my sister, Sarah Roberts, still lives and works with L'Arche in Wolfville, which was also founded which was founded in part by Jeff Moore. And I think Just Us was already going. But anyhow, I have a couple very clear images in my mind. One is of a first visit to this plantation that was just, beautiful and green and very much kind of in the process of getting organized. I kind of remember the feeling of meeting Leocadio Huracan and listening to him, because if anyone else has ever met him, he's just an incredible orator and just a really warm and funny and smart as heck and political as heck guy. And I have this memory of Jeff Moore kind of sitting, kind of crouching down and smelling coffee beans, like gathering, I think they were green beans, but kind of sifting them through his hand. And basically at the end of the delegation, this was, the stop with them was in, I think San Lucas Toliman was one of many different stops that was on that delegation, lots of rides and pickup trucks and that sort of thing. But at the end of the delegation, there was no commitment, but there was, an opening that Jeff was going to take some of the beans back and was going to roast them, and maybe something could happen. Um, and it was, yeah, quite gratifying. And I think a number of years later, when the Breaking the Silence coffee, actually was a thing, and I eventually returned to Nova Scotia in 2001. Um, and I think by around that time, it was a thing that I could buy and give to folks for Christmas presents. And in more recent years, I've occasionally volunteered at the Windsor Forum Farmers Market, where it's sold on a weekly basis by volunteers. So uh, sorry, there aren't a ton of details in that story because it is a very long time ago. But thanks for asking me to share it.
Oh, thank you so much, Lisa. I know when we first talked, I found it so interesting to hear you speak. And at Just Us, this whole year has kind of been looking back on where we came from. So before I had the conversation with you, I talked to Jeff more about like what he remembered. And so Just Us, it's hard to say because Just Us was founded in 1995 and all these things kind of seem to happen in the next few years. So it's hard to say if the trip was before Just Us was started or after. Maybe it had just been incorporated or something like that, but it's really neat to hear all these stories connect. So thank you so much for coming and participating in this. And feel free to stick around. The beginning of something wonderful. So as I said, I had reached out to Jeff and talked to him a little bit about the same story. Um, Yes, so in his words, it was the spring of 1990 where they spent the first week in Mexico City and then snuck into the refugee camps to hear from the refugees themselves. And like Jeff says, there were about 12 of them handpicked like coffee from across Canada to go on this. And it was funded and organized by CUSO International. And at the end of it, they wrote a full report for the Canadian government, encouraging them to take action to push for a peaceful resolution. Fast forward a couple years later to 2001 was when Just Us purchased our first shipment of coffee from the CCDA. This was actually before they were certified fair trade or organic, but with the help of Just Us creating kind of a market for their quality coffee, and in partnership with Breaking the Silence, they were able to receive both of these certifications, which they still have to this day. Just Us and Breaking the Silence are still involved with each other in a number of different ways. So the first one is the monthly with the monthly sale of each bag of coffee, a portion of that goes back to the organization. There are promotions and through grocery stores like Sobeys. We recently just did an online promotion of Breaking the Silence, which went really well. And when you have big customers like Sobeys who love the product, that is certainly a help. I know that before COVID, I had scheduled kind of a tasting in one of the Sobeys for Breaking the Silence, where I was going to have an opportunity to share the stories. And that is not off the table yet. It's still in the works. We're just waiting for it to be a little bit more safe to do things like that. Just Us has an annual contribution that they make to Breaking the Silence. This is our way to support BTS with costs associated with advocacy work, including organizing delegations, human rights accompaniers, the increased cost for coordinators now due to COVID-19. It's also a way that we can show support and allyship with the Indigenous people of Guatemala in an attempt to decolonize. We, like I've said, Just Us sends the workers on delegations, which in turn, they come back and are able to share their stories. I know there was another worker that I went on the delegation with, and when we came back, we hosted a lunch and learn for staff at Just Us. We also have attended staff meetings to educate people on the organization as well. We've sent people a variety of different people to the Breaking the Silence annual gathering. And also for the past couple years, I've organized kind of a virtual meeting with BTS coordinators, and they're able to give kind of like a live update to our workers. So CCDA, I'm sure we've all had a little bit of an experience with them. I'll start off with saying that the CCDA is an Indigenous political organization that Just Us buys coffee beans from, but it also, they are so much more than just that. They help Indigenous people of Guatemala by promoting development in rural areas through many aspects, including social, cultural, and political ways. A saying that Just Us kind of uses is coffee is like the vehicle for change. Coffee is a way that CCDA is able to financially support the resistance ways where they're on the ground in the communities doing the work there, but they also help by looking at the bigger picture and looking at different policies and changes in the policies and also pushing for land reforms. We can talk about those two kind of different aspects in a moment, but what I would like to do first is show you a video which includes Leo Cadio, who Lisa had mentioned. But Leo Cadio is a member of the CCDA and has been a political figure and also a coffee farmer in Guatemala.
Mi nombre es Petronila Tobar, soy de aquí de Cantón Ojo de Agua. Y la vida de aquí del campo como Ojo de Agua, trabajamos en campo, trabajamos en finca. Bueno, en primer lugar nos levantamos a las 3 de la mañana para preparar la comida y llevar al campo. Nosotros salimos a las 5, 5:30, si nos agarra la hora, y llegamos para allá a la finca. Son 2 horas y hay que caminar todo ese camino, mire. Es muy peligroso. Bueno, del café, el trabajo del café es duro y es cuesta. Bueno, el precio del trabajo solo 15 quetzales. Y los hombres, 20. Los que son de ahí, sigan trabajando allí porque no tienen terreno. Porque si tuviera terreno, ni loca uno va a ir. Pero como no hay, a ley tiene que ir uno. No es justo, pero la verdad que con uno ese sí que está en la espalda de la pared, uno no puede hacer nada. Y lo poco que uno ahí va, tiene que ir. A ley, ese sí puro a ley. Y si uno no va a ir a ganar los 5 quetzales, ¿quién le va a dar a su hijo? Va a pasar hambre. Va a pasar hasta ahí en puro hambre, se mueren los niños, hasta uno mismo. Cuesta mucho, pero así tenemos que luchar.
Juan Morales me llamo.
Bueno.
Yo antes sí trabajo en la finca. Como unos 30 años trabajé en la finca, Pampujilá, y nací. Y después, para mi parte, pues, que como tengo un poco de café, mejor que es lo que estoy manteniendo ahora en mi café. Yo, ninguna hora sabe, por más o menos unos 5 arroz. bajo mi casa. Cuesta. Y peor lo que está es la camino que me falta a mí para allá, más de la mitad que voy para arriba. Voy a pasar en una barranca y después lo voy a subir hasta allá más arriba. Nosotros estamos luchando también para venderlo, hombre. Ya probamos, pero no hay solución.
Una gran cantidad de pequeños productores son obligados a tener que vender su café a los intermediarios, y los intermediarios les roban el café un 10 o 15% del peso real que ellos llevan, pero tienen la presión de tener que venderlo, porque si no venden el día que ellos cosechan de la planta, este café se fermenta y pierde la calidad, y luego el día siguiente nadie lo quiere comprar.
Solo como lo que compre gana un poco, y lo que vende ahí también gana otras ahí. Hasta la última, donde entregue seguro, es hasta ahí lo que más se gana. Cuesta. Es lo que están pasando. Siempre se levanta un poco para arriba, solo para que se pase la vida, se le pasa la vida la misma se queja con ese café.
Bueno, yo soy Lesbia Morales y trabajo en el Comité Campesino del Altiplano, CCDA.
Bueno, yo soy Leocadio Huracán, soy el responsable de la comercialización del Café Justicia.
Tenemos el programa Café, que es una parte muy importante para el CCDA.
A través de Café Justicia apoyamos a los productores en la asistencia técnica, en el acompañamiento, en el diseño de plan de manejo, en la fertilización orgánica. El café es estrictamente duro, es un café producido por pequeños productores bajo sombra y en las tierras recuperadas por el movimiento campesino organizado en el CCDA.
Los trabajadores que están con nosotros reciben un salario justo.
Para nosotros el comercio justo significa pagar lo justo que le toca al productor, que debe ganar, también dar el valor humano que tiene el productor, y sobre todo también dar la oportunidad de que ellos sean los verdaderos actores de su desarrollo.
Mi nombre es Clara Culán. Estoy trabajando con el proceso de café orgánico 4 años. Ahorita estamos diciendo a los empresarios que están comprando a nosotros aquí una miseria el valor del café, pero exportando así con los señores del CCDA, ellos lo procesan, sí, da una ganancia un poco más elevada y nos están ayudando a nosotros para la economía familiar.
Aquí es un edificio muy pequeño, así también nos pagan un poco más, mejor que las fincas privadas.
Con la exportadora Tolimán, que está aquí en San Lucas, es una gran finca de un gran propietario. Este terrateniente tiene 6 o 7 trabajadores en su finca. Les paga 22 quetzales al día.
Fíjate que aquí trabajamos a 10 o 12 personas. Según avanza mucho trabajo y también ganamos a proceso a 50 quetzales.
Entonces, en términos económicos, para los trabajadores también, Café Justicia ha contribuido con la economía de sus trabajadores y ha generado trabajo.
En la cuestión del café, en muchos espacios lo hemos dicho y así sigue siendo para nosotros. No es una cuestión únicamente económica. Tratamos la situación política porque creemos que con todos los ingresos que nos vienen nosotros podemos hacer muchos cambios.
Yo creo que el café, comercio justo, convencional, es bueno, porque también paga más que el comercio tradicional. Pero sin embargo, Café Justicia es un comercio un poco más, con más beneficios. El café ha contribuido mucho a las luchas reivindicativas que hacemos, a las luchas políticas que hacemos. Hemos contribuido muchísimo también en la sociedad para organizarse, para buscar su propio desarrollo.
Utilizamos el recurso de una mejor forma, precisamente para ir a hacer las demandas.
Entonces el café tiene una connotación política, cultural, social, bastante importante esta actividad de Café Justicia.
Todo ese trabajo que lleve del café y todo eso, es un sufrimiento, la verdad es un sufrimiento. Entonces lo que yo digo, pues los compradores, ojalá pues que compren un poco más caro de lo que está, porque la verdad que es mucho trabajo lo que lleva.
Solo le queremos pedirle a usted que colabora con nosotros para poder mantener nuestro café, siempre tener un café saludable.
Y el café, bueno, es justicia, precisamente por la reivindicación que hacemos. Nosotros necesitamos muchas cosas con justicia, y precisamente se llama así.
Si crece Café Justicia, está creciendo también la esperanza de que algún día los pequeños productores, los campesinos, indígenas, marginados de este país, podamos tener un mejor nivel de vida y podamos tener también más oportunidades para nuestros hijos, que estamos seguros que son los que van a disfrutar de este esfuerzo y esta lucha.
So the video might be a little bit dated. I think I saw that it came out maybe in 2009 or something like that. But as you can see, like throughout, it talks about a lot of the same things that we're talking about today. And I think it's really important to hear directly from farmers and producers, and not just from me, somebody here sitting here in North America saying what it's like down there. So I thought that video was very important. But back to talking about the CCDA and going how they support the communities. What I recently heard from a presentation was that the CCDA often has to step in and do the work that the government should be doing for these remote communities, but are not. For example, most recently with the COVID-19 pandemic, while the CCDA might have worked from home for a week, it did not stop them at all. In fact, the communities needed their support even more. They went into communities that were so remote that hadn't even been affected by the virus yet, to explain to them and correct any misinformation that they were hearing, but also spoke to them in their native languages so that they could actually understand. They also purchased radio spots in Quechua and other native languages to encourage people to get the vaccination, and again, correcting misinformation that was out there. Like we've seen here in Canada, there's rising costs in items like food. But when it happens in Canada, we have supports that we can rely on, like CERB, for example. But as you can imagine, remote communities in Guatemala definitely do not have those supports. And that's why the CCDA, one of the reasons why the CCDA is so critical. So I was looking through my notebook from Guatemala and I saw this quote there. Repression is a form of murder. They are slowly killing us. And I think that this quote goes to show the necessity of the CCDA in another aspect. We talked just about like how they've supported communities with the COVID-19 pandemic. But this quote comes from a community member in Choctun Basilia, where it's again a community that CCDA supports. And it's the other part of CCDA's work is dealing with the criminalization of community members defending their land. What has historically happened is, and is still happening today, is large landowners and companies are stealing the land from these communities who have owned the land for generations, and they're doing it by falsifying paperwork. Police, of course, are on the side of the big landowners and companies, so they're not stopping them. There's been a huge increase in land evictions during the pandemic, where the government and police will forcibly go into these communities and push the people off their land with tear gas or other means. Then these community members run to the mountains and hide and wait for the government and the police to leave the land. And then they just go back to it because they have nowhere else to go. There are several arrest warrants out for members of the CCDA, which makes it difficult for them to do offer support when it comes to accompanying people to court because of defending their land. Because these community members, they become fearful that the police are looking for the CCDA members. My own experience with the CCDA was when we were visiting, so the community Choctun Basilia and Nuevo Pericio. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce those the best that they could be. But yes, we had gone to see them, and we actually had a member named Lesbia, who was a member of CCDA, who was translating from their native language of Quechua, I believe, to Spanish. And then Lisa Rankin was there to translate from Spanish to English. And again, like, that is another job that is so important, because the community members want us to come back here and share the story, because not everyone knows what is happening in Guatemala. And without Lesbia there to translate, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to hear these stories and pass them on. But one story that really stuck with me is hearing from a woman named Victoria, whose husband was put in jail for defending their land, and she was left to raise 6 children on her own. And prior to her husband going to jail, all of the kids went to school. But once he was put into jail, they didn't have an income, they didn't have any money, and school costs money, so the kids had to stop going to school. And when you think about it, criminalization of these land defenders really ends up hurting the women and the children the most. And these are just a few examples of what the CCDA does, but there are so many more that I could have written a journal on. And there is a really good website that is included in a little package that we have that is in a link in the chat, I believe. So everybody will have access to it, but it's a very good website that gives live updates on the work that the CCDA is doing. And yeah, it's a really great resource. I'm sure that many of us have seen maybe one, maybe two, maybe some of these certifications on different products in the stores. But did any of you know that there are 115 ethical labels available in Canada, which when I first heard that number, I was quite surprised at the amount. As you can see though here, the Fair Trade Federation, WFTO, and the B Corp are organizational certifications, which are different than product certifications. So you would see things like the Rainforest Alliance, Fair Trade International, and SPP on products such as coffee. But those 3 that I mentioned, they're organizational certifications and a little bit more challenging to attain than the product ones. But here is where we're going to try to have a little bit of fun. We have a jam board. Whenever I'm planning something, I always like to think about where it came from. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of history on the fair trade. It was started in the 1940s by religious and NGO groups, bringing crafts back from marginalized groups in the global south, and was a way to create a value chain that went from beginning to shop, which eventually was initiated in Europe as well. So that started in North America. But people can only buy so many handcrafts before they don't really need many more, maybe. And so by the 80s, a similar initiative was started for agriculture products like tea and coffee, sugar. Sugar was, yes. So then in the late 80s, Mark Havelaar Labeling Initiative was created in the Netherlands, which is kind of known as like the first fair trade label. And then the organization, Latin American Coffee Coordinator, or what I will refer to as CLAC, was founded in 1996, which was a network of small producers from Latin America and the Caribbean. And now, today, it represents all fair trade producers in those areas. Fair Trade Labeling Organization, or also referred to as FLOW, was created a year later as kind of an umbrella organization to combine all of these different initiatives and make sure that they were following certain standards. So why do we have certifications like fair trade? Why can't people just pay money and get more money, and why isn't that enough? It's with fair trade, it's about more than just paying more for a product. As you can see listed on the screens, these are principles of fair trade. So transparency and accountability, fair trade practices, fair payment, no child or forced labor, good working conditions, promote fair trade, respect for the environment, and capacity building is a really important one. But an interesting fact that fair trade coffee accounts for 2% of the global coffee sales. But what we see happening through the sale of fair trade coffee is that the actual coffee laborers, not the people that own the land and the farm, are not benefiting from the sales. It's the owners of the farms that are taken care of first to make sure that they can keep their farm going. In a lot of cases, these are family-owned farms, but there are instances where the farm owner does have workers, and these workers are not seeing the benefit of the fair trade sales. What has also happened over the years is fair trade has grown, which makes sense that that could be a good thing, but it also means that the original reasons, like these principles listed here, have gotten watered down or lost. You also have people, oftentimes white settlers, sitting on a board in North America talking about what the producers need and using very colonial language. Like, we may know what is better for them or what's going to work for them or how they should do something. And to understand kind of why we might have that attitude would be back in the 40s when we talked about fair trade when it first started. These religious groups and NGOs that were mentioned were trying to do patchwork and trying to help these people that they thought needed our help. And then in 2018, Fair Trade came out with something called the International Fair Trade Charter, which is it was created to have a common reference document for the fair trade movement. Within the document, there is a section on the fair trade approach, which includes sentences like create conditions of fair trade, providing decent work and helping to improve wages and incomes, and empowering women. And when I was first shown these sentences, I was asked, what kind of language are they using? And I don't know if when I read those out, if anybody thought of what the language was. I can say them again. Create the conditions of fair trade, providing decent work and helping to improve wages and incomes, and empowering women. So after I was asked what kind of language was used, it also raises other questions like, how are these things that they talk about, how are they going to happen? Is it going to happen from us here in the global north, pushing our beliefs, our traditions, our culture on how farmers and producers should improve their lives, or how we think they should improve their lives? Are we going to further colonize their cultures? But what is important to get out of this is the fact that we do not need to do these things. We do not need to create conditions of fair trade. We do not need to empower women in these communities. What we need to do is pay a fair price for the work and the effort that goes into producing coffee or tea or sugar. And the communities that we buy from can then create better lives with the funds from selling their products and by following their cultures and traditions. And not by what we say that they have to do or having to follow a certain legislation. Which brings me to small producer symbol, or SPP. After hearing all of that about the fair trade certification, there was a need for small farmers to find an alternative to fair trade that respected their values, their culture, and the original kind of principles of fair trade. There was also a need to decolonize so that everyone had opportunities to benefit. And in 2006 was when SPP was first marked. And then in 2010, CLAC, which I had mentioned earlier, formally approved general rules and procedures for SPP. And then the first certified SPP products were then marketed in 2011. In 2012, CLAC became a formal member of the Fair Trade International System and made SPP its own independent legal structure. Back in the beginning of the more formal fair trade, while farmers brought ideas to the tables, they never had a say and they didn't have a vote. With SPP, now they have 100% of the say and the vote. I will also add an interesting quote that I heard from a producer in Guatemala, Nelson, who Just Us works with, where it's a positive thing that he had said, but it was that small producers are happy with where they are, but they need more consumers that go beyond brands and labels and concepts. And I think that stuck out to me because you kind of see a certification on a bag and you just assume, okay, they've done everything right. So you buy that. But oftentimes, like if you look into it a little bit more, you might not be able to find any actual concrete evidence that that product is giving back to the producers in a fair and just way. So I think that one of the most important things to remember about SPP is the fact that the organization is owned and run by the small farmers who are able to sit at the table and make the decisions and have a vote. It is the only organization and certification system that is owned by democratically organized small scale farmers. I remember first hearing about SPP, it was probably in 2012, where I was kind of amazed that there was a limit on how big your farm could be and even how many like bees you were allowed to keep. Like there was a limit on how big you could be. And that was something that one of the first things that stuck out to me for SPP. But also to be a part of SPP, you have to be 100% certified organic. Direct relationships are emphasized. And when I say direct relationships are emphasized, I'm not talking about direct trade, which we will go into a little bit here. But it's dealing directly with the buyers of your product. Indigenous rights and local cultures are respected. Local economies and value additions are emphasized. Dignified living and sustainable pricing is another important key factor to SPP. And again, it's independent certification. Producers have solutions too, and they want to work with buyers. The reason that Just Us went with SPP is because of its authenticity of the organization. And I think Joey, who will speak in a little bit on coffee pricing, he actually sits on the board of the SPP, and he sits on that board because they voted him in. He didn't ask to be on their board. The small farmers wanted Joey there to represent the buyers, which is another real key factor, I think, with SPP. And my last little bit that I'm going to talk a little bit about is direct trade, which maybe all of us have heard about. I think that direct trade's biggest difference is in its principles, where they lean towards more of a capitalist approach, where when you think about fair trade, it leans more of like a socialist approach. With direct trade, there are no certifications associated with this, meaning no verification. And typically it's only the roaster that knows where the coffee came from in terms of which farm. Nowadays, though, it is already becoming a little bit outdated because consumers are becoming more educated and they're beginning to see through direct trade. But there are a lot of similar things as to why direct trade became, because of a lot of similar reasons why SPP came to be. It wanted its own way, it went its own way without fair trade because they didn't like what was happening with fair trade. And that is all that I have to say about direct trade for now. I think that there's a lot more. I'm sure you could do an entire webinar on just that or any aspect of this, but that kind of gives you like an overview of it. But now I would like to welcome Joey, who is joining us here today from Just Us Coffee, who is going to be able to explain what this graph means and get into a little bit about coffee pricing. And after our talk on coffee pricing, we're going to try to go into breakout rooms where we can have maybe smaller discussions with groups of people. And we'll do that for a couple minutes, and then we'll come back into this main room where hopefully after your discussion, maybe you'll have a question for Joey or myself. And yeah, so welcome, Joey. I will let you take over.
Great, thanks, Keely. Well, I'm not sure there's much more for me to say, but so great job so far. Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm really happy to be involved in this this webinar. Yeah, I think that I guess where I'll start here is this is a bit of a historical look back on coffee prices in US dollars here over the last 7 or 8 years now. I just updated this today with a December number and you'll notice that the orange, the thing on the bottom, that line that goes along the bottom, has certainly done a bit of a jump over the last year or so, which is good news for producers, despite the fact there's not necessarily a whole lot of rhyme or reason to how these numbers work. It is good when the price goes up. So as you may or may not know, Arabica coffee and Robusta coffee, both the two most well-known varieties of or species of coffee that's turned into a drink globally, are all traded on the global stock exchange. They're a commodity like rice or like sugar or like various other commodities, and they literally change in price based off the bidding by the second, if you're the person that likes to watch those sorts of things. But the thing, I think, I've been with Just Us for about 10 years now. I've only been doing the working with producer partners and those relationships for 6 or so years. One of the first things when I started getting involved and more deeply in the coffee side of the business at Just Us was just noticing how strange this idea of this commodity market price was. When I actually was meeting with producers and talking to them about, talking to them about the costs of producing their coffee. For most of us, Just Us included, we're quite fortunate when we put it, and there's been a bit of a chat there going on. I'll answer your message in a minute, Janelle. But there's a question around the price of the coffee on the retail shelves here at Sobeys or Superstore or otherwise. And we're fortunate at Just Us in that we're actually able to price our coffee. Like, we could calculate our costs of production, right? We know what like how much was the green coffee that went into it? How much is the bag that the roasted coffee goes into? How much was the labor per hour to put the coffee in those packages and ship them out? How much is it cost to make the lights go on at Just Us? How much was the propane that went into the roaster? We can stack those all up and make calculations, and we can say, okay, that's what it costs for us just to get it out the door. Now, what do we need to make in order to make sure the business keeps running? Producers don't get to do that. They get to look at the commodity exchange and see what the price is today, and that's what it is based off of what many say to be the supply and demand of our modern capitalist system. Although the reality is that the supply and the demand in particular is changed, as well as the supply has often been changed ever since 2008, when we had the financial collapse. Particularly real estate and those sorts of things took a big hit during that time. And a lot of the liquidity, a lot of the money that was in the markets at the time shifted over from those kind of strange products that we call financial products that people are buying and trading on the stock exchange. They went from those more complex products into things that were very simple, like commodities. And so ever since, there's been a lot more money in the commodity markets, and certainly coffee has also been the victim of that. And these prices, it's become more of it's a financial tool for hedge funds and for stock exchange enthusiasts than it is actually any kind of an indicator of the costs of producing coffee by small producers. And that's really unfortunate because, of course, there's hundreds of millions of people in the world that depend on coffee for their livelihoods, and only a small number of those people, mostly those living in Brazil, and not even all of them, are able to actually meet their costs of production plus make a bit of a profit with these prices that you've seen in this diagram here over the past 7 or 8 years. You'll see, all the bottom line, that's the stock exchange price for the coffee. So hovering from somewhere between $1 and $1.25, $1.50 over the course of most of that time, US per pound. And just to give you a sense, a pound of green coffee makes about 1 12-ounce bag of Just Us roasted coffee. So this is what the big players would have been paying for coffee futures at the time that these values were recorded over the course of the last 7 or 8 years. So pretty dismal. You'll notice, today I'm biting my nails right now because it's kind of gone the other way recently. And as a company that does all their business in Canadian dollars and has to buy American dollars, which is the currency used to trade in coffee, you can go from $1 last year as the kind of reference point to $2.43 today. So in fact, I had 2 meetings today with producer partners just discussing Central American contracts. I'll be meeting with Elvis Morales from CCDA on Thursday, actually, with Lisa Rankin's going to join me for a conversation with him to discuss the crop and how things are going and our new, the container we'll be buying likely in May or June. But, you know, generally producers are the price takers. They don't have any power within this giant, the workings of the commodity markets. We've been involved recently in a movement called Transparent Trade, or the Specialty Coffee Transaction Guide, which is actually, it's a project trying to find a new context for coffee prices, particularly specialty coffee prices. And by context, I mean, this is one context here that you're looking at on your screen. This is the commodity market. But, you know, when these prices were so low over the years, Just Us wasn't really even paying any attention to them. We were fixing prices based off costs of production and the demands of producer partners in terms of what's a you know, a reasonable cost for the coffee. So, you know, we've been fixing those prices based off of quality and other things that I'll just quickly mention in a second. But, you know, in the end, it's really become more complicated these last couple of days, because of course now we're in the other side of things, and we need to get, how should I put it? When we're bouncing around like this, it's hard to find a point of reference. And so with the Specialty Coffee Transaction Guide, the idea is to actually use the contract prices for 70 or 80 progressive coffee buyers across the world, across the continent, as well as in Europe and beyond, to understand what everybody's paying for these coffees, and to try to get a mean price based off of quality of coffee, off of country, off of size of the lot, those sorts of things, so that we could try to get beyond this particular issue. So the oranges market and the brown at the top is what we've been paying over the course of those 7 or 8 years. On average. So this would be an average number after the whole year of buying was done back in 2013, for example, the $2.58 there on the far left. And it goes up and down based off of the US Canadian dollar exchange as well. And then you see here, the green is the SPP minimum price. The yellow is the Fair Trade International minimum price. So when the price goes down below here in the market, the orange, then these floor prices kick in, and these are for fair trade and organic coffees, so organic as well. And just quickly, when the things that go into costs, they go into the price from our perspective at Just Us, is community development, things like extracurricular activities for youth and communities that keep them in their communities. Things like worker co-op creation for the workers in the processing plants for the co-ops that produce the coffee. Things like a lunch program for the pickers, so they can stop by, pick up a brown bag lunch for free on their way to pick. These are kind of community focused efforts that have a cost to them and should be included. Keely was mentioning direct trade. Sometimes direct trade is known to criticize fair trade for paying co-ops the price as opposed to directly paying the farmers themselves, and that the co-ops are costly and things like this. I mean, the reality is that small producers own their own democratic organizations when they're part of SPP and they're part of fair trade cooperatives. I mean, it costs money to run things democratically. It costs money to learn how to deal with conflict resolution in a big organization like that, how to make your ideas known, how to be part of a big vote for the new board. Of course it costs money, and it should. And it's part of the development and the capacity building within those communities and amongst those producers. The other thing that often gets lost when we look at the prices as just commodity price is that, you know, organic production, you know, we see it all around us, probably more than, you know, some places where we live in cities, but agriculture, even around us here in Nova Scotia, has a huge cost on the environment that often is not factored in. And what organic production or organic premiums try to do is account for the stewardship and this, you know, and try to take account of those extra costs that otherwise would be downloaded into the environment in the form of, you know, synthetic fertilizers, cheap fungicides, things that cause damage, but maybe make it cheap to apply and cheap to kind of in terms of labor on your farm, but aren't necessarily cheap when it comes to the health of the environment around you. Climate change is causing disease, so it's another cost that needs to be added into here, and this is climate change that we are very much responsible for in the global north. And then ultimately, you know, quality and value add. You know, when producers start to add their own value to the product before they sell it to you, there's different microlots that we buy sometimes at Just Us, different levels of quality based off the care. That all gets factored in, and ultimately is factored into the costs of, that we put in the contracts that we agree on with producer partners. So, you know, back last year, I think Just Us, 90% of the coffee that Just Us purchased was at a price that was above the mean of 70 of the most progressive coffee roasters in the world in the specialty coffee transaction guide. So it sounds a little convoluted, but the idea is that, you know, when we look at all those companies and the average, the mean price that they paid for the coffees that are similar to the coffees that we bought, generally our price 90% of the time was higher than that mean. So, you know, if a small company like ours, a little co-op, little worker co-op in Grand Prairie, Nova Scotia, can figure out how to pay those prices, it blows my mind how the big multinationals of the world, who are really making up the other 98%, you know, we talked about 2% of the coffee is fair trade and the other 98% isn't. You know, imagine what they could do with a little bit more of a holistic look at what they're pricing their coffees at when they buy from producers. So that's all I have to say for now. Certainly I'll take questions later on, like Keely said. Thanks, Keely, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Joey.
One is at Just Us Roasters, are all of the coffee roasts SPP certified, or some certified by different labels? And if so, which ones? And do you want me to ask them both and then they can be answered, or one at a time? And the other question is, and this may be hard to generalize, but in coffee producing countries, is it generally the case that folks in country drink fair trade coffee? Like, would you call it fair trade coffee, what people are drinking, say, in Guatemala or in Brazil?
So I can speak to the first question, where right now all of our coffees are certified SPP. I know in past we've had different producers who, like we talked about when we initially bought from CCDA in 2001, and while they weren't certified at first, by purchasing from them, they were able to get those certifications. And we've had a couple of those stories along our way. But at the moment, they are all SPP certified.
Yeah, and I just add, we've got a coffee or two that we double certify as Fair Trade International as well. Because sometimes some of the Fair Trade Canada kind of sponsorship programs or marketing programs require you to be involved in their particular flavor of fair trade. So we do have a product or two that we double certify just to make sure that we're able to take part in that. in terms of drinking coffee at origin, within the countries where people are growing the coffee, I would say that I mean, there's a variety of people, different walks of life growing coffee in Latin America in particular. I can speak more specifically to Latin America, I think. In some countries like Costa Rica or Brazil or even Colombia, there is a fairly well-established specialty coffee and often fair trade coffee industry going on in those countries, due to a fair amount of investment, but also, those are some, particularly in Brazil, it's one of the more profitable coffee industries just because of the mechanization that goes on there, a lot of big farms. But the producers themselves, in some countries like Guatemala, for example, it's much more, the producers in Guatemala are quite a few of them are more like the kind of peasant farming kind of community. And in those particular cases, they're often drinking their own coffee. But so in some ways it's fair trade, but usually they're drinking their own coffee that they wouldn't sell internationally. So it's typically lower grade coffee, so it wouldn't qualify as specialty coffee. So that's one of the most striking things when I first started traveling to those countries, was that they really kept the quite awful looking stuff for themselves, because of course they couldn't sell it, and that's what they made into coffee for their own households. There are some that take some of the best as well now. Like it's changing. It is shifting as specialty coffee and as fair trade becomes more better established. I think that there is a shift, but it really does depend on the community, the culture, those particular growers.
I was curious to hear how Justice is feeling about BTS coffee sales, and if there are other things or any concerns related to that, if they've been waning, if they're over the top, if there are things that we could be doing from our end. And also, I just wanted, as an aside, so I'm here in Toronto and I went into a kitchen table, which is kind of a boutique-y grocery store, and they were selling Breaking the Silence coffee and another Just Us coffee. So it sounds like you guys are expanded from the Sobeys, and congratulations on that. It was selling for $19.99, by the way.
Well, it's good to hear that you found it there, at least. I have a general sense on how it's doing. I think in general it's done very well, in particular this year, like I talked about with that promotion that we had online. I don't know more details other than that. Joey, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the sales have been pretty stable over the last few years. It's come down a little bit this year. I think our sales have been a little bit less of BTS, but it's been fairly stable over the years. Part of the, we've done the thing online. I think we intend to do some promotions at some point at the grocery store level as well. COVID hasn't helped, obviously, just in sales generally. So the fact that BTS came down a little bit in sales is really not an indicator specifically of anything to do with BTS or that particular line of coffee and the CCDA coffee. And in fact, we haven't been able to buy a full container from CCDA over a number of years, but we're starting to use the CCDA coffee in a few other really interesting projects, particularly with Indigenous companies selling coffee here in Canada, and so they're really excited to use BTS coffee as well, or CCDA coffee, I should say. So we've been this year I think we're aiming to bring in a full container as opposed to usually it's somewhere in the 200 bags range, where we can fit probably about 275 in a container. So we'll be buying more from CCDA this year.
Could I just add a little bit to this, saying that I think it will go up again as Suzanne Litke and the Coffee Forum is able to be selling more now, which is exciting, because that's been a huge part, I would think, of our purchases from BTS. But I also want to mention, since we did a history with Lisa Roberts earlier, that Karen Weisbart was our very first intern working with the CCDA at Nuevo Paraíso that Lisa Roberts was talking about. So, and Lisa was also worked that summer after she came back, promoting BTS coffee, and then returned as a volunteer with the CCDA. So just wanted to add that to the history.
It's a small world in this little virtual gathering that we have. So I do want to note that we're at 7:33. I committed to 7:30, but we've had some great questions and conversation. So if you have any further questions, feel free to contact Laura or myself. Laura can contact me or something, and we'll get back to you on them. I just wanted to touch on our call to action. There's a couple different things you can do. One of them would be signing up for the Breaking the Silence newsletter. A while ago, Laura Robinson shared with BTS members about sharing a picture to show support for Maria, who is a Maya Kachib human rights and land defender from El Astor, who has been criminalized for her work providing translation and support to communities in resistance to mega projects. So if you want to send in a picture, there's a certain saying, I believe, Laura, that there is to put on. It can be in English or Spanish. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. And finally, we drafted a letter with the help of Lisa Rankin that we encourage everybody to send to Global Affairs Canada about land evictions and criminal land offenders. And all of that should be included in the link that's in the very beginning of the chat. But yes, thank you so much, everybody, for
Can I just shout out too quickly to St. FX University, a huge supporter of Breaking the Silence over the years, purchases it quite a lot, and just generally some of the campuses here in Nova Scotia in particular. We've really had some interest in that, and generally a lot of support for SPP and Breaking the Silence in some cases more specifically.
Yes, definitely. Very good point. Thank you for that. And that concludes our Solidarity and Coffee webinar. Have a great evening, everyone. And maybe we'll see some of you soon, virtually or in person, who knows.
Nice to see you all. Thanks.
Bye.